The treatment of Japanese prisoners of war in Allied custody during World War II represented a complex intersection of international law, military necessity, public health imperatives, and cultural differences. Between 1942 and 1945, Allied forces captured approximately 50,000 Japanese military personnel across the Pacific and Asian theaters, with the overwhelming majority surrendering in the final months of the war as Japan's military position collapsed. This relatively small number compared dramatically to the hundreds of thousands of German and Italian POWs held by Allied nations, creating unique administrative circumstances and concentrated attention on individual camp operations. The Geneva Convention of 1929, formerly known as the Convention Relative to the Treatment of Prisoners of War, established comprehensive standards for POW treatment to which the United States, Britain, Australia, New Zealand, and other Allied nations were signatories. Though Japan had signed the convention at the 1929 diplomatic conference, the Japanese government never ratified it, leaving Japan technically not bound by its provisions. Nevertheless, Allied policy generally adhered to Geneva Convention standards as a matter of law, policy, and principle, with hygiene and sanitation provisions receiving particular attention given their importance to camp health and order. Article 13 of the Geneva Convention required that camps be maintained under sanitary conditions equal to those provided to the captor nation's own troops. Article 12 mandated that POWs receive adequate food, clothing, and shelter to maintain good health. Additional provisions addressed medical care, camp facilities, and living conditions. These requirements formed the legal framework within which Allied nations established hygiene protocols for Japanese POWs, though practical implementation varied considerably based on location, resources, and circumstances. When Japanese POWs first arrived at Allied camps, they underwent immediate and systematic delousing and sanitation procedures. This was not merely bureaucratic routine or symbolic cleansing, but urgent medical necessity driven by combat conditions in the Pacific theater. The tropical and jungle environments of New Guinea, Burma, the Philippines, and various Pacific islands created ideal conditions for body lice, which transmitted epidemic typhus, as well as mites causing scabies, tropical ulcers, and numerous other parasitic infections. Many prisoners arrived severely malnourished, dehydrated, wounded, and heavily infested with parasites after extended periods in combat zones, often following their initial capture in forward areas where facilities were primitive or non-existent. The initial delousing process followed standardized protocols that evolved and improved throughout the war as new technologies and techniques became available. Upon arrival at a processing center or permanent camp, prisoners were first registered, photographed for identification records, and given preliminary medical screening to identify urgent cases requiring immediate hospitalization. Those deemed stable enough for standard processing then moved through the delousing system. Personal clothing presented significant challenges. Japanese military uniforms, often worn continuously for weeks or months during combat operations, harbored lice, lice eggs, and other parasites in seams and fabric. Severely contaminated clothing was typically burned, both for sanitation and to eliminate potential security concerns about concealed items. Less contaminated clothing underwent fumigation using steam sterilization, heating to temperatures sufficient to kill all parasites and their eggs, or chemical fumigants. In many cases, prisoners' original clothing was simply discarded and replaced entirely with POW clothing to ensure complete elimination of parasites. DDT powder, which became widely available to Allied forces from 1943 onward, following its effectiveness demonstration against typhus in Naples in 1943-44, revolutionized delousing procedures. Medical personnel applied DDT powder directly to prisoners' bodies, paying particular attention to hair, armpits, groin areas, and other body regions where lice concentrated. The procedure involved liberal dusting of powder, often using hand-operated dusters or bellows-type applicators. Each prisoner might receive several ounces of DDT powder during initial processing, with the white powder visibly covering skin and any remaining clothing. Medical examinations accompanied the delousing process. Physicians or medical corpsmen conducted visual inspections of skin condition, checking for scabies, tropical ulcers, fungal infections, and other dermatological conditions common among combat veterans in tropical environments. They examined scalps for lice and nits, checked for signs of malnutrition including edema and muscle wasting, and conducted basic assessments of general health status. Prisoners showing signs of infectious diseases were immediately segregated into isolation facilities pending further evaluation. At Camp Cowra in New South Wales, Australia, which held approximately 2,000 Japanese POWs at its peak, the initial processing facility operated as an assembly line. Prisoners moved through stations, registration and documentation, disrobing and clothing storage or disposal, shower with germicidal soap, DDT application, medical examination, clothing issuance, and assignment to barracks. System could process approximately 100 prisoners per day when operating at full capacity, though this rate varied based on prisoners' physical condition and any complications requiring additional medical attention. The entire process took approximately 45 minutes per individual in well-organized camps operating under normal conditions, though it could extend to several hours when large groups arrived simultaneously or when prisoners required additional medical intervention. The psychological and cultural dimensions of initial processing required careful management despite the military context. Japanese servicemen had been indoctrinated with beliefs about the profound dishonor of capture, with military education emphasizing that soldiers should fight to the death rather than surrender. The code of Bushido and military indoctrination portrayed capture as the ultimate shame, bringing disgrace upon the soldier, his family, and his emperor. For men raised and trained in this cultural context, the vulnerability and exposure of complete disrobing before enemy personnel could be profoundly distressing, compounding the psychological trauma of capture itself. Allied medical personnel received varying degrees of cultural sensitivity training. Some camps employed personnel with knowledge of Japanese language and culture, including Nisei soldiers who served as interpreters and cultural liaisons. These individuals could explain procedures, provide reassurance, and help bridge cultural gaps. Instructions to conduct procedures efficiently, but without unnecessary humiliation, reflected recognition of prisoners' dignity, though the definition of unnecessary left considerable room for interpretation. Cultural misunderstandings occasionally occurred, as Western assumptions about nudity, bodily privacy, and personal space differed significantly from Japanese cultural norms, particularly regarding public bathing traditions and concepts of modesty. Allied camps varied considerably in their shower facilities depending on location, size, date of establishment, and theater priorities. The evolution of these facilities reflected both increasing experience with POW administration and changing circumstances as the war progressed. Larger permanent camps in the continental United States, Australia, and New Zealand typically featured adequate shower facilities with hot and cold running water, concrete floors, drainage systems, and sufficient capacity for their populations. These facilities often resembled standard military shower installations, with multiple shower heads in open bays, concrete or tile surfaces, and central changing areas. At Camp McCoy in Wisconsin, which held Japanese POWs from 1943 onward, the shower facilities represented standard military construction adapted for POW use. The main shower building accommodated 50 men per hour when operating at full capacity, with scheduled bathing 3 times weekly for the entire camp population. Each prisoner received approximately 5 to 10 minutes of shower time, depending on schedule pressure, with soap provided by camp administration from military stocks. Water temperature was regulated through mixing valves to prevent scalding while providing water hot enough for effective cleansing, typically maintaining temperatures between 100 and 110 degrees Fahrenheit. The schedule allowed for the entire camp population of several hundred prisoners to shower within each 72-hour cycle, with adjustments made for work details, medical issues, or other special circumstances. The physical layout of shower facilities reflected both functional requirements and security considerations. Shower rooms opened onto changing areas where prisoners disrobed and stored clothing in temporary lockers or on benches. Guards maintained visual supervision through windows or from elevated positions, balancing security requirements with prisoners' dignity. Separate entrance and exit flows prevented congestion and maintained orderly processing. Drainage systems channeled water to septic systems or municipal sewage connections, with floor slopes ensuring complete drainage to prevent standing water that could harbor mosquitoes or create slip hazards. Contrast these permanent facilities with conditions at temporary camps established in forward areas during active combat operations. Camps in New Guinea during 1944, holding Japanese POWs captured during the Bougainville, New Britain, and New Guinea campaigns, operated with far more primitive arrangements. Some prisoners bathed in designated river sections under guard, with specific times allocated and guards positioned to prevent escape attempts. Others used barrel showers, 55-gallon drums with perforated bottoms elevated on wooden frames, filled by hand with water heated in separate drums over fires. Prisoners stood beneath these crude showers while others poured water, creating a rudimentary but functional bathing system. These primitive facilities, while basic by any standard, nonetheless represented significant improvement over combat conditions where bathing might not occur for weeks at a time. They met basic sanitation requirements and reduced disease transmission, fulfilling the fundamental purpose, if not the ideal form, of hygiene facilities. Medical officers in forward areas accepted these limitations as inevitable given combat zone constraints, focusing on ensuring at least minimal bathing frequency and soap availability rather than facility quality. The frequency of bathing generated administrative discussion and policy evolution throughout the war. Initial U.S. Army regulations for POW camps specified bathing as frequently as necessary to maintain health and cleanliness, which camp commanders typically interpreted as 2 to 3 times weekly based on standard military practice. However, Japanese cultural practices traditionally valued daily bathing, with communal bathing holding significant cultural importance beyond mere hygiene. The Japanese Afuro tradition emphasized prolonged soaking in very hot water, a practice deeply embedded in Japanese social life and personal routine. Some camps with adequate facilities and no compelling resource constraints permitted daily shower access when practicable, recognizing that this accommodation served multiple purposes. Better personal hygiene reduced disease transmission throughout the camp, protecting both prisoners and allied personnel. Improved prisoner morale from respecting cultural practices contributed to camp order and cooperation. Additionally, regular bathing provided structured activity that occupied time and created routine, both important factors in camp management. The humanitarian dimension, simply allowing people to maintain familiar personal practices, also motivated some camp commanders, though this reasoning rarely appeared in official justifications. Conversely, some camps maintained minimum frequencies even when greater access might have been feasible, based on security concerns, resource constraints, or simple administrative conservatism. Water supply limitations in some regions, particularly in arid areas of the American Southwest, where camps like those in Arizona operated, necessitated water conservation that precluded daily showering for large populations. Coal or oil requirements for heating water in colder climates created fuel considerations. Guard staffing requirements for supervised bathing activities competed with other security duties. These practical constraints meant that policy flexibility existed primarily in well-supplied, permanently established camps rather than universally. Soap supplies presented ongoing logistical challenges that required continuous attention from camp quartermasters. Allied camps provided bar soap as a standard issue, typically the same harsh lye-based soap issued to Allied servicemen for both bathing and laundry purposes. This soap, while effective for cleansing, bore little resemblance to the gentler commercial soap civilians used. The standard military soap contained high levels of lye, making it alkaline and somewhat harsh on skin, though its cleaning effectiveness was undeniable. Soap rations varied by camp, but generally provided each prisoner with sufficient quantity for both bathing and laundry needs. A typical allocation might be 1 bar of soap per prisoner per week, with additional soap available through camp canteens where such facilities existed. This amount exceeded survival minimums, but remained well short of generous, requiring prisoners to carefully manage their soap supply if they wished to wash clothing frequently while maintaining adequate bathing soap. Japanese prisoners occasionally requested, or were permitted to purchase supplementary toilet articles through camp canteens using wages from work details or funds sent by the Japanese government through neutral intermediaries. These canteens, where established, offered items like toothpaste, tooth powder, shaving soap, combs, and sometimes better quality bathing soap. Availability varied tremendously based on camp location and supply chains, with camps in continental United States generally offering more extensive canteen stocks than those in remote Pacific locations. The International Committee of the Red Cross Inspections specifically noted soap availability as a standard metric of camp conditions. ICRC inspectors checked whether prisoners received adequate soap, whether supplementary purchases were possible, and whether any shortages had occurred. Their reports documented soap supplies alongside food rations, clothing adequacy, and medical care as indicators of overall camp conditions and Geneva Convention compliance. Toothbrushes and tooth powder or toothpaste represented another hygiene challenge. Many Japanese servicemen had experienced limited dental care during their military service, and dental hygiene supplies were not always prioritized in military logistics. Allied camps generally provided toothbrushes and dentifrice, though quality and regularity varied. Some prisoners fashioned makeshift toothbrushes from available materials, while others simply went without when supplies were unavailable. The long-term dental health consequences of limited dental hygiene were significant, but generally overshadowed by more immediate medical concerns. Shaving supplies varied by camp policy and prisoner status. Some camps provided razors under supervision, allowing prisoners to shave regularly. Others restricted razor access based on security concerns, though this became less common as camp security procedures matured. Many Japanese servicemen had relatively limited facial hair compared to Caucasian prisoners, making shaving less urgent for some individuals. Though this varied considerably and cultural preferences for clean-shaven appearance remained strong among many prisoners. Combs and personal grooming items were typically issued or available for purchase. Hair cutting occurred regularly, with designated prisoners often trained as barbers serving their fellows under supervision. These prisoner barbers might receive small privileges or additional canteen scrip for their services. The barbering function served practical hygiene purposes. Shorter hair was easier to maintain and less hospitable to lice, while also providing purposeful activity and social structure within the camp. Regular medical inspections formed a critical component of camp hygiene protocols, serving multiple interrelated purposes. These inspections monitored for infectious diseases that could spread rapidly through concentrated populations, identified malnutrition or illness requiring treatment, tracked ongoing medical conditions, and provided early warning of potential epidemics threatening both prisoners and camp personnel. The systematic nature of these inspections distinguished them from reactive medical care, creating a proactive health surveillance system. Standard procedure in established camps involved weekly sick call and monthly comprehensive medical examinations, though specific schedules varied by camp size, medical staffing, and local conditions. During sick call, prisoners with complaints could present to medical personnel for evaluation and treatment. The monthly comprehensive examinations were more systematic, with medical personnel checking all prisoners whether they reported complaints or not. These comprehensive inspections involved multiple components. Medical personnel conducted visual examinations of skin condition, looking for rashes, lesions, or signs of scabies and other dermatological conditions. They examined scalps for lice infestations, checking both for live lice and for nits attached to hair shafts. Oral examinations checked for dental problems, mouth lesions, and signs of nutritional deficiencies like bleeding gums or smooth tongue indicating vitamin deficiencies. Weight monitoring tracked each prisoner's nutritional status over time, with significant weight loss triggering dietary intervention or medical evaluation. Personnel listened to lungs for signs of respiratory infection or tuberculosis, palpated abdomens for abnormalities, and conducted general health assessments. Given the tropical diseases prevalent in the Pacific Theater where most Japanese POWs had served, particular attention focused on malaria, dengue fever, dysentery, and parasitic infections like hookworm, roundworm, and liver flukes. Many prisoners arrived with active infections or as asymptomatic carriers of parasites. Medical protocols included routine stool examinations for parasites, blood smears for malaria when symptoms suggested infection, and careful monitoring for signs of tropical diseases that might manifest weeks or months after capture. At the POW camp in Featherston, New Zealand, which held approximately 800 Japanese prisoners from 1943 until the war's end, medical staff maintained detailed health records for each prisoner. Weekly inspections systematically rotated through the camp population, with comprehensive monthly examinations ensuring every prisoner received evaluation at least 12 times annually. The medical staff included both New Zealand military doctors and enlisted medical personnel, supplemented by prisoner medical personnel working under Allied supervision. This staffing allowed reasonably thorough examinations despite the workload. Medical inspection records from Featherston document the disease patterns found among Japanese POWs. Approximately 15% showed evidence of current or past malaria infection. Nearly 30% harbored intestinal parasites requiring treatment. Malnutrition signs appeared in over 40% of prisoners upon arrival, though nutritional rehabilitation programs reduced this significantly within weeks. Tropical ulcers, often initially misdiagnosed as combat wounds, required extended treatment in many cases. These findings were generally consistent with medical reports from other Allied camps holding Japanese POWs. The challenge of tuberculosis required special vigilance and protocols. Tuberculosis had been endemic in the Japanese military, with crowded barracks, inadequate nutrition, and lack of screening creating ideal transmission conditions. Many captured Japanese servicemen had been exposed to TB during their service, and the disease's long incubation period meant active cases could appear months or even years after initial exposure. The chronic nature of TB and its communicability in crowded conditions made it a significant camp health threat. Allied medical officers instituted chest X-ray screening programs where radiological equipment was available. Mobile X-ray units sometimes visited camps lacking permanent equipment, conducting mass screening of prisoner populations. Suspicious findings led to follow-up examinations, sputum testing for tubercle bacilli, and isolation of confirmed cases. Camps maintained isolation wards specifically for active TB cases, with infected prisoners separated from the general population to prevent transmission. At Camp Livingston in Louisiana, which held several hundred Japanese POWs, medical records indicated approximately 8% of prisoners showed evidence of tuberculosis exposure based on skin testing, though active disease cases remained under 2% due to early detection and isolation protocols. The camp maintained a separate isolation barracks for TB patients, where they received the limited treatment options available in the 1940s, primarily rest, nutritious diet, and supportive care. Streptomycin, the first effective antibiotic against TB, became available only in 1944 and remained in limited supply, reserved for severe cases. Dental hygiene and care presented particular difficulties that medical inspections regularly documented. Many Japanese POWs arrived with severe dental problems, abscesses, advanced decay, broken teeth, and periodontal disease, resulting from years of inadequate dental care during military service compounded by poor nutrition. Japanese military dental services had been limited even before war's outbreak, and wartime conditions further reduced preventive care and treatment availability. Combat zone service provided essentially no dental care beyond emergency extractions for acute infections. Allied camps with dental officers provided extractions, basic restorative work, and treatment of acute infections. However, comprehensive dental rehabilitation was rarely possible given resource limitations, the volume of cases requiring attention, and competing medical priorities. Many prisoners received necessary extractions and acute care, but little preventive or restorative dentistry. This situation improved somewhat in larger, better-equipped camps, but remained problematic in smaller or more remote facilities. Medical inspection reports documented dental problems extensively, though solutions often lagged behind identified needs. Clean clothing and bedding represented essential elements of hygiene maintenance and disease prevention. Body lice lived in clothing seams, not on human skin, making regular clothing exchange and laundering critical for lice control. Allied camps typically issued each prisoner 2 complete sets of clothing, one to wear while the other was laundered, allowing rotation without leaving prisoners without clean clothing during laundry processing. Clothing types and quality varied significantly by location and supply availability. In the continental United States, prisoners often received surplus military uniforms dyed or marked to identify them as POWs. Some camps used blue denim work clothing similar to that worn by civilian workers. In Australia, khaki uniforms with identifying patches distinguished POWs. In forward areas, prisoners received whatever surplus clothing was available, sometimes including captured Japanese uniforms altered with identifying marks, surplus Allied uniforms, or even civilian clothing requisitioned locally. The Geneva Convention required that clothing be appropriate for local climate and sufficient to maintain health. This meant winter uniforms and coats in cold climates, lighter clothing in tropical areas, and adequate footwear year-round. Implementation of these standards varied, with some camps providing excellent clothing supplies while others struggled with shortages, particularly of proper sizes for smaller-statured Japanese prisoners, when stocks consisted primarily of uniforms manufactured for larger-statured American servicemen. Laundry facilities operated on regular schedules essential to maintaining clothing hygiene. Larger permanent camps maintained mechanical laundry facilities with washing machines, extractors for removing water from washed items, and sometimes steam presses or mangles for finishing. These facilities, similar to military laundries serving Allied troops, could process large volumes efficiently. Camp Stoneman in California, a major processing and holding facility, operated laundry facilities capable of processing laundry for over 1,000 Japanese POWs weekly alongside the camp's other populations. Each prisoner received clean clothing and linens every 7 to 10 days on a rotating schedule. The laundry operation used hot water, typically 140 to 160 degrees Fahrenheit, and military-issue detergent to ensure effective cleaning and sanitization. Particular attention focused on bedding, which could harbor lice eggs, body oils, dead skin cells, and potentially scabies mites if infestations occurred. The laundry process involved sorting by type and contamination level, washing in hot water with detergent, rinsing, extraction of excess water, and drying either in mechanical dryers or on outdoor clotheslines depending on facility and weather. Heavily soiled items might receive pre-soaking or additional wash cycles. Items suspected of lice contamination received higher temperature washing or steam treatment to ensure complete elimination of parasites and eggs. Smaller camps relied on more primitive manual laundry facilities, concrete wash tubs, scrubbing boards, soap, and clotheslines. These facilities required more labor but could maintain adequate clothing hygiene when properly operated and supplied. In some camps, prisoners performed their own laundry under supervision, using provided soap and designated washing areas. This arrangement had several advantages. It reduced administrative burden on camp staff, provided prisoners with purposeful activity and control over personal cleanliness, and accommodated personal preferences in clothing care that varied individually. Prisoner-operated laundry systems typically involved scheduled access to laundry facilities, with groups rotating through on assigned days. Prisoners received soap rations, accessed hot water where available, and washed their clothing using techniques familiar to them. Supervision ensured security and proper use of facilities. Some prisoners developed considerable expertise, offering laundry services to others in exchange for small favors or items, creating informal camp economies around various services including laundry. Bedding standards varied but generally met or exceeded Geneva Convention requirements when supply chains functioned adequately. Most camps provided each prisoner with a mattress or straw tick, 2 blankets, sheets where available, and a pillow or pillowcase stuffed with available materials. Regular exchange of bedding occurred monthly in well-organized camps, with soiled items sent to laundry facilities for hot water washing and sanitization. This schedule prevented accumulation of body oils, dead skin cells, and potential parasites in sleeping quarters, while ensuring prisoners always had reasonably clean bedding. Blanket washing required particular care given wool's tendency to shrink in hot water. Laundry procedures specified cooler wash temperatures for blankets, sometimes using special wool wash compounds. Despite these precautions, blanket shrinkage remained a persistent problem, particularly when inexperienced personnel conducted washing. Camps maintained stocks of replacement blankets to address this normal attrition, though supply sometimes lagged demand during periods of logistical strain. Maintaining sanitary barracks required constant attention, regular cleaning schedules, and systematic inspection. Japanese POW barracks followed standard military construction adapted from designs used for Allied troops. Typical barracks were wooden frame buildings with rows of double-decker bunks along side walls, central aisles for circulation, attached or nearby latrine facilities where infrastructure permitted, and sometimes day rooms for recreation when space allowed. Barrack size varied from small structures housing 30-40 prisoners to larger buildings accommodating 100 or more. Daily cleaning schedules, typically performed by prisoners under guard supervision, included sweeping of floors to remove dirt and debris, mopping with disinfectant solutions to sanitize surfaces, dusting of surfaces and bunks, ventilation through opening windows and doors when weather permitted, and removal of trash and refuse to designated collection points. These routines, familiar to anyone with military experience, maintained basic cleanliness and hygiene when consistently executed. Disinfectant solutions used in mopping typically consisted of creosol, chlorine-based compounds, or other military standard disinfectants diluted according to specifications. These solutions killed bacteria, viruses, and other pathogens on floor surfaces, reducing disease transmission. The characteristic smell of disinfectant became a defining sensory feature of military barracks worldwide, familiar to prisoners as it had been during their own military service. Pest control extended beyond personal delousing to comprehensive environmental management. Rodents, flies, mosquitoes, and cockroaches all posed health threats in camp environments, transmitting diseases, contaminating food, and generally degrading living conditions. Allied camps employed multiple control strategies based on military sanitation doctrine developed over decades of troop housing experience. Regular trash removal prevented accumulation of refuse that attracted flies and rodents. Camps established trash collection schedules, with prisoners carrying refuse to designated collection points for removal to dumps or incinerators. Proper sewage disposal through septic systems or sewage connections eliminated breeding sites for flies and reduced contamination risks. Screening of windows and doors where feasible physically blocked flying insects from barracks interiors. Elimination of standing water removed mosquito breeding sites, particularly important in tropical locations where malaria and dengue remained threats. Chemical control measures supplemented physical and sanitary methods. DDT spraying became routine in camps from 1944 onward, significantly reducing mosquito populations and thus malaria transmission risk. Spray teams treated barracks interiors, focusing on walls, corners, and dark spaces where mosquitoes rested during day. Outdoor spraying of vegetation near barracks and standing water sources complemented interior treatment. The effectiveness of DDT against mosquitoes and other insects seemed almost miraculous to those who had experienced pre-DDT pest problems, though concerns about DDT's environmental and health effects would emerge only decades later. Rodent control utilized traps, poisons, and elimination of food sources and harborage. Camps established protocols for food storage, both in mess facilities and in barracks, to deny rodents access. Structural maintenance sealed holes and gaps that rodents could exploit. Systematic trapping and poisoning programs reduced rodent populations, though complete elimination proved impossible in most camps given the concentration of food, trash, and human habitation that inevitably attracted mice and rats. The quarters inspection system, borrowed directly from military practice, involved regular formal inspections of barracks by camp officers. These inspections occurred weekly in most camps, with officers examining cleanliness, proper storage of personal items according to established patterns, maintenance of assigned areas, absence of contraband or prohibited items, and identification of needed repairs or sanitation issues. Prisoners received advance notice of inspections and were expected to prepare their areas to standards defined in camp regulations. Inspection standards replicated those familiar from military service. Bunks made to specifications with blankets properly arranged, personal items stored in designated locations, floors clean, windows clean, areas neat and orderly. Camp staff sometimes posted visual guides showing proper bunk-making technique and item arrangement to ensure clear communication of expectations despite language barriers. Prisoners who maintained areas above minimum standards might receive recognition through small privileges, additional canteen privileges, extra recreation time, or simply verbal acknowledgement. Japanese cultural emphasis on cleanliness and order generally aligned well with Allied sanitation requirements, creating less friction than might have occurred with some other populations. Many prisoners organized their own internal cleaning schedules beyond required minimums and maintained standards higher than strictly necessary. The cultural value placed on cleanliness, orderliness, and proper arrangement of spaces reinforced camp hygiene requirements in ways that facilitated rather than complicated maintenance of sanitary conditions. However, overcrowding in some camps made sanitation maintenance difficult regardless of cultural values or individual effort. When Camp Cowra's population exceeded 2,000 in mid-1944, the increased density strained facilities designed for smaller numbers. Barracks became crowded. Latrine facilities faced higher usage requiring more frequent cleaning, laundry schedules compressed, and shower facilities struggled to accommodate everyone within reasonable timeframes. Under these conditions, maintaining hygiene standards required additional effort, resources, and vigilance from both prisoners and camp staff. Adequate latrine facilities were absolutely essential for disease prevention, particularly for controlling waterborne diseases like dysentery, typhoid, and cholera. Allied camps employed different systems depending on infrastructure availability, with considerable variation between established permanent camps in developed areas and temporary facilities in forward zones. Camps in developed areas typically connected to municipal sewage systems where geographically feasible, providing flush toilets discharging to established sewer networks. Where municipal connections were impossible, camps maintained septic systems with proper drainage fields, settling tanks, and outflow management according to public health standards. These systems, similar to those serving small towns or military bases, provided sanitary waste disposal when properly designed, constructed, and maintained. Standard specifications derived from military sanitation doctrine called for one toilet fixture per 30 prisoners and one urinal per 25 prisoners, with washing facilities immediately adjacent. These ratios ensured adequate capacity to prevent excessive waiting, crowding, and the unsanitary conditions that could result from inadequate facilities. Larger camps maintained multiple latrine buildings positioned strategically throughout the compound for convenient access from different barracks areas, reducing walking distance and time required for prisoners to access facilities. Latrine buildings typically featured concrete floors with floor drains for washing, adequate ventilation through windows or mechanical ventilation where power was available, lighting for nighttime use, and durable fixtures resistant to heavy use. Stall dividers provided some privacy between fixtures while allowing supervision. Adjacent washing facilities included troughs or individual sinks with running water and soap for hand washing after toilet use. These facilities required intensive maintenance. Daily cleaning, often multiple times daily in heavily used facilities, used disinfectant solutions to sanitize fixtures, floors, and other surfaces. Prisoners assigned to latrine cleaning details performed this unglamorous but essential work under supervision. Despite being among the least desired work assignments, proper latrine maintenance was critical enough that camps often selected reliable prisoners for these details, and sometimes provided small incentives or privileges in recognition of the importance and unpleasantness of the work. Forward area camps and temporary facilities relied on more primitive systems. Pit latrines, essentially holes dug in the ground with wooden seats or platforms above them, provided basic sanitation where infrastructure development was impractical. Military sanitation doctrine specified detailed requirements for pit latrines to ensure they functioned adequately without creating health hazards. Specifications included minimum depth, typically 6 feet to provide adequate capacity, and distance from water sources to prevent contamination. Pit latrines required regular maintenance involving several practices. Human waste should be covered with quicklime daily to reduce odor, speed decomposition, and kill pathogens. A layer of earth should be added periodically, with at least 6 inches of earth required when pits neared capacity and required closure. This layering system controlled flies, reduced odor, and began the decomposition process that would eventually neutralize the waste. When pits reached capacity, They were sealed with earth and new latrines dug at different locations. Sites of old latrines were marked and left undisturbed for extended periods to allow complete decomposition. This rotation system, while primitive, effectively prevented disease transmission when properly maintained and followed according to established procedures. The system had been proven through decades of military field sanitation use, and despite its crudeness, worked adequately under conditions where more sophisticated systems were impossible. Chemical toilets represented an intermediate technology sometimes employed in temporary camps or as supplements to other facilities. These portable or semi-permanent toilets used chemical solutions to decompose waste and control odor, with periodic emptying and disposal of accumulated waste. While more convenient than pit latrines in some respects, chemical toilets required regular servicing and supplies of chemicals, making them suitable only where logistics could support these requirements. Hand-washing facilities adjacent to latrines represented a critical disease prevention measure emphasized in both Geneva Convention requirements and military sanitation doctrine. Camps provided wash basins or troughs with running water where possible, or basins refilled regularly in locations where plumbing was unavailable. Soap dispensers or soap bars allowed prisoners to wash hands after toilet use, directly reducing fecal-oral disease transmission that caused dysentery and other intestinal infections. Signs in Japanese instructed prisoners in proper hand-washing technique and emphasized the importance of washing before meals and after latrine use. These signs represented recognition that proper behavior mattered as much as physical facilities. The best wash basins accomplished nothing if prisoners didn't use them. Camp staff sometimes posted guards near latrines during meal times to observe whether prisoners washed hands before proceeding to mess halls, though consistent enforcement of hand washing proved challenging given staffing constraints and the practical difficulty of constant supervision. Educational efforts supplemented physical facilities and supervision. Medical personnel sometimes conducted hygiene instruction classes for prisoners, explaining disease transmission mechanisms, the importance of hand washing, proper latrine use, and other hygiene practices. These classes served both immediate practical purposes and long-term public health goals, since improving prisoners' health knowledge could benefit them even after repatriation. The extent of such educational efforts varied tremendously by camp, depending on available medical staff time, translator availability, and command emphasis on preventive health measures. Kitchen and mess hall sanitation directly impacted prisoner health, with foodborne illnesses capable of spreading rapidly through concentrated populations eating common-source food. Allied camps maintained separated food preparation areas designed and operated according to military food service sanitation protocols. These areas featured concrete floors allowing thorough cleaning, screened windows and doors to exclude flies, adequate ventilation to remove heat and odors, proper lighting, and sufficient equipment for food storage, preparation, and serving. Kitchen facilities included refrigeration for perishable items where power was available, dry storage for non-perishables, preparation areas with stainless steel or easily sanitized work surfaces, cooking equipment including ranges and ovens, and cleaning areas with hot water for washing utensils and equipment. The organization of space separated raw and cooked food to prevent cross-contamination, provided adequate room for staff to work without crowding, and allowed systematic flow from storage through preparation to serving. Kitchen personnel typically consisted of prisoners working under supervision of Allied mess sergeants or other food service personnel. This arrangement utilized available manpower while ensuring adherence to Allied standards and maintaining security. Selected prisoners received training in Allied food service procedures, learned to operate unfamiliar equipment, and adapted to preparing food for large groups according to menus and specifications quite different from Japanese military rations. Food service sanitation protocols followed established military procedures: regular hand washing for all kitchen personnel, use of clean utensils and serving equipment, proper food storage temperatures to prevent bacterial growth, thorough cooking of meats to internal temperatures sufficient to kill pathogens, washing of vegetables and fruits to remove dirt and reduce contamination, and protection of prepared food from flies and other contamination sources. These procedures, routine in military food service, became emphasized training points for prisoner kitchen workers to ensure understanding and compliance. Kitchen facilities underwent daily cleaning with hot water and detergent, with weekly comprehensive sanitation using strong disinfectants. This schedule maintained baseline cleanliness, while periodic deep cleaning addressed accumulated grease, grime, and potential bacterial growth in hard-to-reach areas. Equipment received particular attention. Slicing machines, mixers, steam kettles, and other tools where food contacted surfaces required thorough cleaning after each use and regular disassembly for detailed sanitation. Mess halls where prisoners ate also required sanitary maintenance. Tables and benches were wiped with disinfectant solutions between meal sittings. Floors were swept and mopped after each meal. Adequate ventilation removed food odors and moisture. Screens on windows and doors excluded flies. Trash receptacles were emptied frequently to prevent overflow and attraction of pests. The repetitive nature of these tasks required consistent performance regardless of weather, workload, or other factors. Mess kits issued to each prisoner required cleaning after every meal, creating a critical control point for disease prevention. Camps established washing stations outside mess halls with multiple stages. Scraping of food residue into designated receptacles, washing in hot soapy water, rinsing in clean water, and often a final rinse in boiling water or chemical sanitizer solution. This three-stage system, familiar from military practice, effectively eliminated foodborne pathogens when properly executed with adequate water temperature and contact time. The washing stations typically consisted of large tubs or basins, often 30-gallon garbage cans, filled with water maintained at specified temperatures. The first station with hot soapy water loosened and removed food particles and grease. The second station with clean rinse water removed soap and additional residue. The third station with very hot water, 180+ degrees Fahrenheit, or chemical sanitizer killed remaining bacteria. Prisoners passed through these stations in sequence, with periodic changing of water as it became contaminated or cooled below effective temperatures. Foodborne illness outbreaks, while relatively rare in well-administered camps, did occur and triggered systematic responses. When multiple prisoners reported gastrointestinal symptoms suggesting food poisoning or waterborne disease, medical officers conducted investigations to identify the source and prevent further cases. These investigations examined recent menus, food preparation procedures, water supplies, kitchen sanitation, and individual cases to determine common exposures. A 1944 incident at a California camp involving several dozen cases of gastroenteritis led to enhanced kitchen supervision and modification of food preparation procedures. After investigation, identified probable cross-contamination between raw and cooked foods. The outbreak triggered immediate responses. Affected prisoners received medical care, kitchen operations underwent review, potentially contaminated foods were discarded, enhanced sanitizing procedures were implemented, and staff received additional training. Such events, though disruptive and concerning, provided opportunities for procedural improvements that reduced future risks. Nutrition and food quality, while related to hygiene primarily through their effects on health and disease resistance, also connected to sanitation through food storage and handling requirements. Geneva Convention standards required that POW rations equal those provided to captor nations' depot troops in quantity and quality. Implementation of this standard meant Japanese POWs in Allied camps generally received adequate calories, protein, and essential nutrients. A dramatic improvement over combat rations most had experienced and far superior to the starvation rations that characterized many Japanese-run POW camps. Menus in Allied camps typically provided 2,500 to 3,000 calories daily, with rice as a staple food supplemented by vegetables, protein sources, and bread. Efforts were made to accommodate Japanese dietary preferences where possible, providing rice rather than relying exclusively on bread or potatoes, including soy sauce when available, offering fish in addition to meat. However, these accommodations were limited by supply availability and practical constraints. Many camps served essentially American military rations, adapted slightly toward Japanese preferences rather than authentically Japanese food. The adequacy of nutrition directly affected hygiene and disease resistance. Well-nourished prisoners recovered more quickly from illness, resisted infections more effectively, and maintained better skin integrity, reducing sites for infection. Malnutrition weakened immune systems, slowed healing, and created vulnerability to opportunistic infections. The generally adequate nutrition in Allied camps, while imperfect, supported health maintenance and disease resistance as part of the overall hygiene program. Safe drinking water represented perhaps the most fundamental hygiene requirement, essential not only for consumption but for food preparation, bathing, laundry, and cleaning. Contaminated water could rapidly spread typhoid, cholera, dysentery, and other devastating diseases through camp populations. Allied camps therefore devoted considerable attention to water supply quality and availability. Camps in developed areas typically connected to municipal water supplies that met public health standards. These systems provided treated water from reservoirs or wells, processed through filtration and chlorination to ensure microbiological safety. The U.S. Army required that POW camps have access to water supplies meeting the same standards as water provided to American military personnel, ensuring comparable safety levels. Water quality testing occurred regularly, with samples analyzed for bacterial contamination, chlorine residual levels, and other parameters. When tests indicated problems, immediate corrective actions included increased chlorination, investigation of contamination sources, provision of alternative water sources, and notification to camp populations if boiling or other precautions became necessary. Such events were rare in camps connected to municipal systems, but required preparedness and systematic monitoring to detect and correct problems quickly. Forward area camps faced far greater challenges without access to municipal water infrastructure. Water sources required identification, testing, and often treatment before use. Rivers, streams, wells, or rainwater collection provided raw water that might be contaminated with bacteria, parasites, or chemical pollutants. Field water purification units provided solutions to these challenges. The Lyster bag, a canvas water bag with chlorination system, represented one common field purification method. Raw water filled the bag, chlorine compounds were added according to water volume and contamination level, and after appropriate contact time, the chlorinated water was considered safe for consumption. Other systems used chlorine tablets or iodine tablets added to filled water containers, with waiting periods before consumption. More sophisticated mobile purification units could process larger volumes through filtration and chlorination systems mounted on trailers or trucks. Camps established protocols for water point operation to ensure continuous supply of safe water. These protocols included designated filling times to prevent crowding, supervision to prevent contamination of water sources or stored water, regular testing of water quality, and posted instructions in Japanese regarding proper water handling and the importance of not contaminating water supplies. Guards at water points enforced procedures and monitored for security, while medical personnel or trained technicians managed purification equipment and testing. Each prisoner typically had access to unlimited drinking water, a significant contrast to combat conditions where water rationing was common. Camps in hot climates like Arizona, Southern California, or Northern Australia placed particular emphasis on hydration given heat stress risks. Water stations throughout compounds provided convenient access, with guards ensuring prisoners could obtain water as needed. Medical personnel educated prisoners about importance of adequate hydration in hot weather, recognizing that heat illness posed serious risks in desert or tropical environments. Ice water or cooled drinking water became available in some camps with adequate resources, though this amenity was far from universal. Where refrigeration or ice production capacity existed, camps sometimes provided cooled water during hot weather as a heat mitigation measure. This exceeded strict Geneva Convention requirements but reflected practical public health considerations. Heat illness reduced overall camp health, created medical cases requiring treatment, and in extreme cases could cause deaths that were both humanitarian tragedies and administrative complications. Prevention through adequate hydration and cooling measures made practical sense. Water for bathing, laundry, and cleaning represented separate considerations from drinking water, with lower purity requirements. Water used for showering didn't require the same treatment standards as drinking water, though basic sanitation remained important. Heavily contaminated water could transmit skin infections even if not consumed. Most camps used the same water supply for all purposes, but when separate sources existed, lesser quality water might be acceptable for non-consumption uses, conserving treated water for drinking and food preparation. Water conservation became necessary in some locations despite adequate quality. Camps in arid regions faced supply limitations requiring rationing and careful management. Shower schedules partly reflected water availability rather than just administrative preference. Laundry operations scheduled around water availability. Watering of campgrounds for dust control competed with other uses. These constraints required trade-offs and priorities, with drinking water and food preparation receiving absolute priority, followed by essential hygiene uses, then discretionary purposes. The significant cultural differences between Japanese prisoners and Allied captors created challenges and opportunities for adaptation within the hygiene system. Some cultural practices aligned naturally with Allied protocols, while others required compromise, negotiation, or sometimes simply acceptance of differences within the constraints of security and resources. Japanese bathing traditions centered on the afuro, a deep tub filled with very hot water for prolonged soaking after washing thoroughly outside the tub. This practice differed fundamentally from Western showering, where washing and rinsing occurred under running water. Many Japanese prisoners found Allied shower facilities unfamiliar and less satisfying than their traditional bathing method, though they adapted to necessity. Some camps accommodated these preferences within practical limits. Japanese prisoners at several camps built traditional wash areas for laundry, incorporating cultural practices into camp routine with Allied approval. These areas might include low concrete basins for scrubbing laundry, designated soaking areas, and efficient drying arrangements. Prisoners took pride in these facilities, often maintaining them to high standards and using them extensively despite, or perhaps because of, their self-built character. A camp established on Guadalcanal in late 1943 used captured Japanese bath equipment, large metal tubs heated by wood fires beneath them, to provide bathing facilities for prisoners. This arrangement required minimal Allied resources since the equipment and expertise came from prisoners, while providing culturally familiar bathing that prisoners appreciated. The very hot soaking baths, though foreign to Allied personnel supervising the facility, met sanitation requirements while accommodating cultural preferences. This type of practical cultural adaptation often occurred when camp commanders recognized that accommodation cost little while improving prisoner morale and cooperation. Food preferences represented another area where cultural accommodation intersected with hygiene. Japanese dietary traditions emphasized rice, soy products, fish, pickled vegetables, and specific preparation methods. While Allied camps couldn't fully replicate Japanese cuisine given supply and knowledge limitations, efforts to provide rice regularly, include soy sauce when available, and respect certain food taboos acknowledged cultural differences. Some camps even allowed prisoners to cultivate small gardens where security and space permitted, growing traditional vegetables and seasonings that supplemented camp rations while providing familiar tastes. These food accommodations related to hygiene indirectly through their effects on nutrition and morale. Prisoners who found food acceptable were more likely to maintain adequate nutrition, supporting health and disease resistance. Higher morale from cultural respect could increase cooperation with camp routines, including hygiene protocols. The connections were subtle but real, illustrating how hygiene existed within broader systems of camp administration and prisoner management. Religious and cultural practices around cleanliness also received varying degrees of accommodation. Many Japanese prisoners maintained personal cleanliness standards rooted in cultural values and religious influences, sometimes exceeding minimum Allied requirements. Camp authorities generally encouraged this, recognizing that strong intrinsic motivation for cleanliness reinforced rather than competed with camp hygiene requirements. Where prisoners wanted to maintain higher standards of order and cleanliness than required, this was viewed as beneficial rather than problematic. Language barriers complicated cultural understanding and practical communication. While some camps employed Japanese-speaking personnel or prisoner interpreters, many did not. Instructions, signs, and communications often occurred through minimal shared vocabulary, gestures, demonstration, and pictures. This created inevitable misunderstandings about procedures, expectations, and requirements. Posted signs in Japanese explaining hygiene procedures, disease prevention, and facility use helped bridge gaps, though translation quality varied, and some concepts proved difficult to communicate clearly across language and cultural divides. Despite generally adequate hygiene provisions by World War II standards, Allied camps faced periodic challenges, resource limitations, and shortcomings that affected prisoner health and camp conditions. Honest examination of these difficulties provides balanced perspective on wartime POW administration, while acknowledging that even well-intentioned systems operated under significant constraints. Supply shortages, particularly in forward areas during active combat operations, sometimes resulted in temporary inadequacies. Soap became scarce periodically, with shipments delayed or diverted to combat units. Clothing replacements lagged demand as stocks were exhausted faster than supply systems could replenish them. Medical supplies ran low when shipping was disrupted or requirements exceeded allocations. Maintenance of facilities sometimes suffered when construction materials, repair parts, or skilled labor were unavailable or redirected to combat priorities. These shortages were typically temporary rather than chronic, resolved as supply situations improved or alternative sources were found. However, they created periods when prisoners received less than standard provisions, facilities degraded, or conditions declined below acceptable levels. Camp commanders during shortage periods faced difficult decisions about rationing scarce resources, prioritizing among competing needs, and communicating with prisoners about temporary hardships. Overcrowding periodically strained hygiene systems designed for specific population capacities. The surge of Japanese prisoners in mid-1945 as organized resistance collapsed overwhelmed some facilities. Camps designed for hundreds suddenly held thousands. Shower facilities faced multi-hour daily operation trying to accommodate everyone. Latrine capacities proved inadequate, requiring rapid expansion. Laundry backlogs developed as facilities couldn't process increased volumes within normal schedules. Barracks became crowded beyond original design capacity. These overcrowding situations required rapid responses, construction of additional facilities, expansion of schedules, increased staff to handle added workload, and sometimes temporary acceptance of degraded conditions until capacity caught up with population. While camp authorities worked to address overcrowding quickly, the interim periods could see conditions deteriorate significantly below established standards. The sudden end of the war in August 1945 created particular challenges as repatriation planning proceeded, while camps dealt with populations larger than ever anticipated. Cultural differences occasionally created friction despite accommodation efforts. Japanese preferences for very hot bathing water sometimes conflicted with Allied concern about burn risks and practical limits of water heating capacity. Specific methods of washing or bathing that prisoners considered proper might seem wasteful or unnecessary to Allied personnel focused on efficiency and throughput. Food preferences couldn't always be accommodated given supply limitations and unfamiliarity with Japanese cooking. These cultural misalignments, while often minor individually, accumulated to create ongoing sources of misunderstanding and dissatisfaction. Guards and camp personnel sometimes lacked cultural sensitivity or understanding, viewing Japanese prisoners through prejudiced lenses or with active hostility given the brutal nature of Pacific combat and Japanese treatment of Allied POWs. While official policy emphasized correct treatment, individual attitudes varied enormously. Some guards treated prisoners with professional correctness or even humanity, while others displayed contempt, hostility, or indifference. This variation meant prisoner experiences differed significantly even within the same camp, depending on which guards they encountered and those guards' attitudes. Medical care limitations extended beyond hygiene to treatment capabilities. While Allied camps provided care vastly superior to Japanese facilities, they still operated with 1940s medical knowledge and technology. Antibiotics were new and limited. Many tropical diseases lacked effective treatments. Surgical capabilities in camp hospitals were basic. Mental health care was essentially non-existent. These limitations meant that while camps prevented many diseases through hygiene and treated what they could, prisoners suffering certain conditions received minimal effective care simply because medicine couldn't yet provide better options. The psychological trauma of capture, imprisonment, and separation from homeland received almost no systematic attention. Hygiene programs addressed physical health, but ignored mental health needs that would be recognized as important by later standards. Depression, post-traumatic stress, anxiety, and other psychological conditions went largely unrecognized and untreated. While this reflected general 1940s attitudes toward mental health rather than specific failures of POW care, it nonetheless represented a significant gap in holistic prisoner welfare. The International Committee of the Red Cross played a crucial role in monitoring POW camp conditions, conducting regular inspections that evaluated compliance with Geneva Convention standards, including hygiene provisions. These inspections provided external oversight, created documentation of conditions, and offered mechanisms for identifying and addressing problems. ICRC involvement represented the international community's attempt to maintain humanitarian standards even during total war. ICRC inspections examined multiple aspects of camp operations relevant to hygiene. Inspectors toured shower facilities, evaluating capacity, cleanliness, maintenance status, water temperature, and accessibility. They observed laundry operations, checking schedules, equipment condition, and adequacy for camp populations. Medical care received detailed review, including medical personnel qualifications, facility adequacy, medicine availability, disease rates, and treatment of sick prisoners. Food service, sanitation, and nutrition were evaluated through kitchen inspections, menu reviews, and observation of meal preparation and service. Living conditions inspections examined barracks cleanliness, pest control, adequacy of bedding and clothing, latrine facilities, ventilation, heating where relevant, and general sanitation. Inspectors interviewed prisoners, sometimes in private, allowing confidential reporting of grievances or problems. They reviewed camp records including medical logs, disciplinary records, work assignments, and administrative documents. The comprehensive nature of these inspections meant camps faced regular accountability for maintaining standards. ICRC inspection reports for Japanese POW camps in Allied hands generally noted satisfactory to good conditions, with hygiene provisions typically meeting or exceeding minimum standards. Reports might note shower facilities adequate with regular schedules maintained. Prisoners receive sufficient soap and clean clothing. Medical care available with qualified personnel. Specific commendations sometimes appeared. Kitchen facilities exceptionally clean and well managed, or medical inspection system thorough and well documented. However, inspectors did identify problems and make recommendations. Reports might note shower capacity insufficient for current population, recommend additional facilities, or medical isolation ward lacks adequate ventilation, improvements needed. These recommendations carried weight, as Allied governments were committed to Geneva Convention compliance and responsive to ICRC concerns. Camp authorities usually implemented recommendations when practicable, sometimes requesting additional resources or modifications to enable compliance. The inspection reports served multiple functions beyond immediate oversight. They provided documentation that Allied nations were meeting international legal obligations, important for diplomatic purposes and post-war accountability. They created pressure for continuous improvement, since camps knew inspections would occur and deficiencies would be noted. They offered mechanisms for prisoners to communicate concerns through neutral intermediaries rather than only through their captors. ICRC forwarded summary reports to Japan through neutral countries, providing information about treatment of Japanese POWs in Allied hands. The extent to which Japanese authorities reciprocated by allowing comparable ICRC access to Allied POWs in their custody varied greatly, with systematic obstruction and denial far more common than transparency. This asymmetry in openness to inspection itself documented different approaches to POW treatment and international law compliance. The ICRC role illustrated broader principles underlying Allied POW policy. Despite total war against an enemy guilty of systematic atrocities against Allied POWs, Allied nations maintained commitments to international humanitarian law. This represented both practical calculation, reciprocity hopes, diplomatic considerations, maintaining Allied unity, and genuine moral commitment to civilized warfare standards. The mundane details of shower schedules and soap rations documented in ICRC reports represented these larger principles implemented in daily practice. Understanding Allied hygiene provisions for Japanese POWs benefits from comparative context examining conditions in Japanese-run POW camps and broader historical patterns. These comparisons illuminate the significance of hygiene differences and their consequences for prisoner survival and welfare. Conditions in Japanese-run POW camps were dramatically and systematically worse than Allied facilities, with catastrophic consequences. American, British, Australian, and other Allied POWs in Japanese custody experienced endemic disease, starvation, brutality, and neglect that produced mortality rates of approximately 27%. Over 1 in 4 prisoners died in captivity. Japanese disregard for hygiene, sanitation, medical care, and basic human welfare created hellish conditions, documented extensively in survivor accounts and post-war investigations. Allied POWs in Japanese camps rarely received adequate bathing facilities, soap, clean clothing, or medical care. Disease ran rampant. Dysentery, tropical ulcers, beriberi, malaria, cholera, and other conditions killed thousands. Starvation weakened prisoners to skeletal conditions, making them vulnerable to disease and unable to resist infection. Work demands pushed dying men beyond human endurance. Brutality and arbitrary violence added to systematic neglect. These conditions reflected Japanese military culture's contempt for prisoners, resource constraints, and deliberate cruelty. In contrast, Axis POWs in Allied hands experienced mortality rates under 4%, a dramatic difference reflecting fundamentally different approaches. German and Italian POWs in American, British, and other Allied camps received Geneva Convention compliant treatment including adequate food, shelter, medical care, and hygiene provisions. Japanese POWs received comparable treatment to European prisoners, demonstrating consistent policy application across different enemy populations. This disparity in treatment and outcomes reflected not only different resource bases, though Allied industrial capacity certainly enabled better provisioning, but fundamentally different philosophies. Allied nations viewed Geneva Convention compliance as legal obligation and moral duty, treating prisoners humanely even when reciprocity was absent. Japan's non-ratification of the convention and cultural attitudes toward surrender as ultimate dishonor created conditions where systematic maltreatment became normalized. The contrast in hygiene provision alone demonstrates these different approaches. Regular showers, delousing, clean clothing, and medical care in Allied camps versus endemic parasitic infection, filthy conditions, and medical neglect in Japanese camps illustrated different values and choices. These differences had life-or-death consequences. Many Allied POWs died of preventable diseases that adequate hygiene could have prevented, while Japanese POWs in Allied hands generally survived with health maintained through systematic sanitation and medical care. Even compared to European theater POW camps, Japanese prisoner facilities in Allied hands generally met similar standards despite Pacific theater logistical challenges. The remote island locations, tropical diseases, and extended supply lines of the Pacific theater created difficulties absent in Europe. Yet camps in Australia, New Zealand, the American Southwest, and even Pacific Islands maintained hygiene standards comparable to camps holding German prisoners in the American Midwest. This consistency demonstrated policy commitment transcending operational convenience. Historical perspective also requires acknowledging that World War II POW care, even in well-run Allied camps, fell short of modern standards. Medical knowledge was limited, mental health ignored, cultural sensitivity minimal, and conditions harsh by contemporary expectations. Comparing 1940s POW camps to 21st-century detention facilities reveals dramatic evolution in international humanitarian law, medical capabilities, and human rights consciousness. What seemed acceptable then often appears inadequate now. Yet historical evaluation must assess actions against contemporary rather than modern standards. By World War II standards, and compared to actual alternatives, Allied hygiene provisions for Japanese POWs represented relatively humane treatment. The systematic attention to sanitation, disease prevention, and medical care, while imperfect demonstrated commitment to humanitarian principles even toward an enemy conducting systematic atrocities against Allied prisoners. The provision of adequate hygiene for Japanese POWs in Allied camps during World War II represented complex intersection of international law compliance, military necessity, public health imperatives, cultural accommodation, and humanitarian commitment. The systematic attention to showers, delousing, inspections, and sanitation created conditions that maintained prisoner health, prevented disease outbreaks, and demonstrated Allied adherence to civilized warfare standards even under difficult circumstances. These hygiene programs served multiple purposes beyond immediate prisoner welfare. Disease prevention protected Allied personnel and civilian populations from epidemics that could spread from camps. Maintaining prisoner health reduced medical care burdens and enabled work details that contributed to war efforts. Documented compliance with Geneva Convention standards supported diplomatic objectives and post-war accountability. Perhaps most importantly, treating even enemy prisoners humanely affirmed democratic values and maintained moral standards during total war. The mundane details of soap rations, shower schedules, and latrine maintenance represented civilization's maintenance under pressure. In an era of industrial warfare's mass slaughter, strategic bombing of cities, and systematic atrocities, the provision of clean clothing and medical inspections might seem trivial. Yet these small dignities preserved amid mechanized conflict demonstrated that humanity could persist even in war's depths, that international law and moral standards need not become war's first casualties. The contrast between Allied and Japanese treatment of POWs illustrated different philosophical approaches with life-or-death consequences. While systematic differences in resources, culture, and policy all contributed to disparate outcomes, the fundamental distinction lay in whether nations viewed prisoners as retaining human dignity deserving basic care, or as having forfeited rights through the dishonor of capture. Allied commitment to former position, however imperfectly implemented, produced dramatically better prisoner survival and welfare. This historical record offers lessons extending beyond World War II POW administration. It demonstrates that adherence to humanitarian standards remains possible even during existential conflict against brutal enemies. It shows that systematic attention to mundane details, hygiene, sanitation, medical care, produces meaningful human welfare outcomes. It illustrates how international oversight through organizations like the Red Cross can promote compliance and improvement. It reveals how cultural sensitivity and accommodation within security constraints can reduce friction and improve conditions. Modern detention practices, military medical care, and international humanitarian law have evolved significantly since 1945, incorporating lessons from World War II POW experiences. Contemporary standards emphasize not only physical health but mental health, cultural respect, dignity preservation, and rights protection. The gap between 1940s practice and modern standards reminds us that humanitarian evolution continues, with today's adequate potentially becoming tomorrow's insufficient as consciousness expands and capabilities improve. Yet historical judgment must appreciate that people act within their time's knowledge and constraints. The Allied personnel who operated POW camps, medical officers conducting inspections, guards supervising showers, engineers designing sanitation systems, commanders establishing hygiene policies, worked with 1940s medical knowledge, cultural understanding, and resource availability. Within those constraints, their systematic attention to prisoner hygiene represented genuine humanitarian commitment that saved lives and maintained standards amid war's brutality. The provision of showers, delousing, and sanitation for Japanese POWs in Allied camps ultimately demonstrated that democratic nations could maintain civilized standards even when enemies abandoned them. These unglamorous but essential services, documented in inspection reports and medical records, preserved human dignity in circumstances designed to destroy it. They showed that even in total war's mechanized fury, humanity's small courtesies, clean water, soap, medical care, could persist, affirming values that transcended immediate conflict and outlasted specific wars. That persistence itself, in retrospect, may have mattered more than any temporary military advantage, representing democracy's moral resilience when tested by total war's demands.